Hey friend, welcome. I'm so excited to have you here listening to another episode of the Pattern Design Circle podcast. Here we talk all about the ins and outs of designing knit and crochet patterns and running a business that makes it all possible. I'm Jessica, your host, knitting pattern designer, design mentor, and the friend in your ear. Can't wait to dive right in. The Pattern Design Circle podcast is sponsored by the Pattern Design Circle, a membership community for knit and crochet pattern designers that are feeling lost, lonely, or frustrated in their business. It connects you with a supportive community that's always eager to answer your questions and help you through the hard times. And there's loads of resources and activities specifically catered to business and designing. Sound like your jam? Check it out at snickerdoodleknits.com/design-circle. That's snickerdoodle, like the cookie, knits, knits.com/design-circle. All right, let's get into it. Hello, and welcome to episode 7 of the Pattern Design Circle podcast. Today, we're going to be talking all about starting your first pattern design. So, super excited to be back in your ear chatting, and I'm so happy that you came to hang out with me. So I hope if this is your first time creating a pattern design or you're new to pattern design, that you find some really helpful, actionable tips from this episode. As always, if you still have questions afterwards, feel free to reach out to me on Instagram at Pattern Design Circle Podcast, and I'm happy to answer all of your questions. Might even lead into a follow-up podcast. We'll see. Anyway, I want to go ahead and spread a foundation, a basis understanding before we start this conversation. This conversation is assuming that you already have a design idea. So we're assuming that you have an idea of kind of what you want to create. Say you know that you want to create a asymmetrical triangle shawl with 3 different stitches. One's lacy, one's darter, and one is something else. And you just have no idea how to bring this together to actually create a design that you love and want to share with the world, and that you then can make a pattern from and share with the world as a pattern. So I am going to be sharing step by step for this process. Because this is your first design, I recommend following this process, but as you get more familiar with the design process, I definitely recommend tailoring it completely to you, what works best for the way that your brain works, the way that you're inspired, all of that, because we work differently. There is no one size fits all process, which is great, because that means that we don't have to fit into a box that doesn't fit us. So to start with, you have a design idea, right? What's going to be the first step? I think the first step is to choose the yarn that's going to work really well for your design idea. Now, if you're having difficulty choosing a yarn right off the bat, you may find it helpful to go ahead and swatch your stitches that you have in mind to get an idea of how they're going to look in different yarns. So you can just pull some yarn from your stash if you have some yarn around, or you can go to a big box store and find some clearance yarn or something like that if you're worried about the finances. And just swatch up your different textures. So we said we have 3 textures for this shawl idea. Swatch up all 3 of those textures in the different kinds of yarns that you have in mind. And then you can choose which yarn or yarns. Maybe you want a different yarn for each stitch type. Swatch up all of those in the different yarns to get an idea of what yarn you actually want to use. Then you get your yarn. So you can do that by asking for pattern support. You can, not pattern support, yarn support, by reaching out to Indie Yarn Dyer, telling them about your idea, what you have in mind, asking if they'd be interested in providing yarn support, which means they send you the yarn. And it's typically under the assumption that you're going to market their yarn, basically. It will be in your pattern and you'll share it on your social media, things like that. I do recommend, actually having some sort of agreement, whether that's signed or not, that really outlines the expectations so you know exactly what's expected of you and they know what is expected of them. I do have an episode all about collaborating with yarn dyers. That is episode, I will look it up really quickly. But if you're interested in going that route, definitely, consider that an option. How to collaborate with indie yarn dyers was episode 2 here on the Pattern Design Circle podcast. And so that episode will really tell you how those collaborations work and what to expect and things like that. Or of course, the other route is by yarn. I did that for my first few designs, and then pretty much everything since then has been yarn support. The exception is my dishcloth patterns. I buy my cotton yarn from big box store, and I have a couple of super bulky patterns that I've made with Lion brand yarn that I've just bought from a box store. So now that you have your yarn, you can actually do your actual swatch. that's in air quotes, actual. This lets you know exactly what it's going to look like in your yarn. And if you didn't swatch before choosing your yarn, I usually don't. I usually wait until I have the actual yarn to swatch. This is when you're going to really make your final decisions on which stitch motifs you're going to use, how the shaping is going to work, trim details, that kind of stuff. So going forward with this asymmetrical triangle idea, you could go ahead and swatch it according to the shape. Go ahead and start it how you want to start it. And you just might make a mini shawl, basically. Like if it starts with stitch motif 1 and works 200 rows with one stitch motif, you don't want to knit all of that for your swatch. So maybe you work 10 rows for your swatch, and then you do 10 rows of the next stitch, and so on and so forth. The idea of the swatch is that it allows you to see exactly what your design's going to look like. As far as the stitches are concerned, the shaping is concerned, the edges are concerned, so that you know that you're going to be happy with the end result before you have the end result. So then once you have the swatching done and you really know exactly where you want to go, what you want to do, I personally recommend making notes. With your first design, you probably aren't going to feel comfortable going ahead and writing the whole pattern right now. If you do, that's amazing. I recommend doing that as your next step, because, well, doing the math first and then writing the pattern. But if you're able to write the pattern before you knit or crochet it, then you can essentially test the pattern as you work through it. Otherwise, what happens is that you make you make your sample, and you take really good notes while you're making it so that you can write the pattern. So assuming that you're not comfortable writing the pattern just yet, I've kind of combined steps 3 and 4 depending on what you're making, and it might be something that you kind of go back and forth between steps 3 and 4. And so that is the math and the knitting. So for math, if we're using our asymmetrical triangle example with using 3 stitches, your math is going to account for the increases as your triangle gets larger. It's going to adjust your stitch motifs according to the stitch increases. So often you have to add some extra stitches on the ends of your rows and stuff to accommodate that increase, because when we have a stitch motif, like from a stitch dictionary, it is assuming a square. It's over the same number of stitches. And when we're increasing one side, we're going to need to add more stitches into that stitch motif. So that's the main math that you're going to be doing for your shawl. At the end, you can use your gauge to do your math for the size. If your size is really important to you beforehand, you could do that math beforehand using the gauge of your swatch. But for something more complicated, like that needs to be fitted, basically, there will be more math involved. So it might be something, depending how familiar you are with the math, how comfortable you are with math, you can either do all of the math beforehand and then do the knitting, or what I see most often with beginners is that you do a little bit of the math to get you to the first part. So you can go ahead and make, knit, or crochet the first section, and make sure you like that, and then do the math for the next section, so on and so forth. And so that's why I have steps 3 and 4 as math and knitting, because often, especially as beginner designers, it kind of happens at the same time. We want to be able to check our work, want to make sure that it's right, want to make sure we're actually liking it, because it can be hard to visualize before you've actually started knitting, or crocheting. Nothing against crocheters here. The really, 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 really important part of these steps 3 and 4, math and knitting, is to take notes. Take really, really, really good detailed notes of what you're doing. Because when you're writing the pattern, what you're going to have to do is tell exactly how you do it. And so often even more experienced designers, think that we're going to remember what we did, or we're going to be able to read our knitting and it's going to be easy. And it's not. We forgot something, or we can't figure out exactly what we did. And that can be a source of frustration down the road. So definitely take really good notes while you're knitting and doing the math, to make your life a lot easier down the road, so you don't have to make another sample. And then the final step is going to be writing the pattern. So I think this is usually the most overwhelming part for designers. A lot of times, if we're wanting to design, it's because we have a design idea. We have a vague idea of how to get there, because it's kind of similar to the knitting process as far as swatching yarn, like picking out yarn, swatching, and then knitting. But of course, there's the math in there. But then writing the pattern is often one of the most uncomfortable parts for beginner designers. There's a lot of folks, and if this is you, don't feel bad at all. You are not alone. A lot of folks get to this step and they kind of just feel like they hit a brick wall. They have no idea where to start, what to do, and just get so frustrated and kind of just break down, becomes a whole procrastination game. So my recommendation for where to start when you're just starting writing your pattern is to look at other patterns and pay attention to what you like and what you don't like about what they're doing. So this can be things like formatting, where they have their photos, how big the photos are. It can be things like titles. It can be things like font. It can be things like where the abbreviations are located and where the yarn information is located. Something for me, when I started designing, I hated that the abbreviations were always at the end of the pattern. And I wanted them at the beginning so that they were really easy to refer to when I was just starting the pattern. So for me, all of my abbreviations are always before the instructions. And then going through patterns is also going to give you an idea of what information you actually need in your pattern. Things like gauge and needle information and yarn information, all of that stuff. Episode 8, the episode after this one, also has all of that information. It's all about what to include in your pattern. So once you get to that stage, definitely give that a listen, because I go more in depth in all of that. But you'll also want to think about, before you start writing your pattern, Are you wanting to create written instructions or charted instructions, or both? Because that obviously changes how you're actually writing the pattern, how much of the pattern is written out and how much of it is in a chart. It's going to depend it's going to affect whether you need to learn a charting software or quote unquote, you're just writing out the instructions, basically using the abbreviations. And then in the pattern, make sure you share everything that you did to make the design. Because the whole point of the pattern is that your design is now replicable. So somebody else can make the same thing, get the same results. If you leave out information from what you did, how is somebody else supposed to know how to make the thing? So the whole point of the pattern is to make it really clear about what they need to do to get the same result as you. And so really the combination of looking at other pattern examples, thinking about what you like and you don't like, what works well for you, what doesn't, and then just your whole notes of everything you've done. That basically is what your pattern is. So it doesn't have to be super huge, overwhelming. You can, it's totally doable. And, if this is something that you continue to have some trouble with, you're really trying to sort through how it's going to work for you. I do offer one-on-one coaching. And I have folks who come to me and are like, I have no idea where to start. And I'm happy to help you. So if that is something that would be helpful, the booking page is snickerdoodleknits.com/design-coaching. So that's snickerdoodle, like the cookie, knits.com/design-coaching. And I'll also have that linked in the description for the podcast episode. But yeah, that is what designing is. So when you're starting your first design, it's all this whole process of picking out the yarn, swatching with it to really get a good idea of what you actually want this to look like, what kind of details you want to include, doing the math to make it possible, knitting the sample, and then writing the pattern. And so really, when we have this big picture of what we want to do, design a pattern, the way to make it feel more doable is to break it up into these steps. So in general, whatever you're doing, if something's feeling overwhelming, break it down into steps to really understand what needs to happen to get there. And then it feels so much more doable. Because first of all, you just have to do the first step. So for the context of this conversation, that is choosing your yarn. Does that feel doable? And then it's swatching. And then it's the math, if you need to do math before you start knitting. And then it's the knitting. On the notes. Don't forget to take notes. And then it's writing the pattern. So you've totally got this. I'm so excited. I hope that if you're listening to this podcast to create your first design, please share that first design with me. I would be so excited to see it. You can send me an email about it or send me a photo or a message or whatever on Instagram at Pattern Design Circle. I absolutely love hearing from you and knowing that this information is both helpful and applicable and that you're actually using it. So I'm so excited for you. You're going to do so well. I promise. There will be hiccups. Don't expect it to be completely smooth sailing, but don't be afraid to reach out and ask for help as well. So happy designing, and I'll talk to you on the next podcast. Wow. Thanks so much for listening to this episode. If you found it valuable, please share the podcast with a designer friend. And if you have a minute, leave a review. It's so helpful for me and means the world to me. Chat soon.